So in this week's video, I'm sharing 7 signs of passive-aggressive behavior in codependent relationships. So in this video, we're going to talk about passive-aggressive examples and what does it mean to be passive-aggressive, and stay until the end where I give you the key to how to stop being passive-aggressive. But first, if you're new, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So what does passive-aggressive mean? So passive-aggressive behavior is an indirect style of communication that feels a little hostile and definitely uncomfortable when you're on the receiving end of it. So for example, your words and behaviors don't match. For example, somebody asks you for a favor. A direct answer would be, sure, I can absolutely help you out, or I'm sorry, I really can't this weekend. A passive-aggressive example of that would be, well, sure, don't I always help you? Or of course I'm gonna help you, your family. See how different that is? There's a slight aggressiveness in my tone, but it's very indirect and it's very confusing because on the one hand, I'm saying yes, but on the other hand, my tone says something entirely different. My tone indicates that I really don't want to be doing it. So why is passive-aggressive behavior so common in codependent relationships? When you grow up being codependent like me, you grow up not having your thoughts and feelings validated. So you learn to hide how you really feel. And you learn to communicate your wants and needs, if at all, in a very indirect way because you're really scared of being rejected. So the indirect way of communicating feels a lot safer than direct communication, where the other person might actually say no to you. When you're codependent, you worry about offending people or thinking that if I'm too direct, I'm going to appear selfish or self-centered. So indirect communication actually feels a lot more comfortable. If this is you, say me too in the comments. I'm right there with you, but this video is going to help. So before we get to the examples of passive-aggressive behavior, I want to talk a little bit about the consequences, because when we're passive-aggressive, people don't know what you want and need, and it creates a lot of confusion. So here are 7 examples of passive-aggressive behavior that tend to come up in codependent relationships. So the first example of passive-aggressive behavior in codependent relationships is giving somebody the silent treatment. So maybe somebody you love has done something to upset you and you don't really want to say directly, but you're so upset, you hold it in and you end up giving them the silent treatment. I know this can last for days and it's really uncomfortable, but we also don't want to make ourselves bad or wrong for any of these behaviors because let's face it, we've learned them growing up and they worked to an extent, but they're probably not working anymore. Because when we give somebody the silent treatment, we're really communicating that we're not willing to participate at all because we'd rather go away, hide out, and stay safe. Some people even call this ghosting. I know for me, I've done this where I have not called somebody back for days or weeks because I don't want to address what happened in the last conversation. That's an example of giving somebody the silent treatment where we just ghost the other person. Another example of passive-aggressive behavior in codependent relationships is procrastinating. And I thought this one was really interesting when I did the research for this video. Say your partner asks you to pick up their dry cleaning or do them some kind of favor, and you say, well, sure, I will, but you actually don't because you're really still upset about what happened the night before that hasn't been talked about yet. So you don't really put it high on your list and you end up forgetting about it. That's an example of passive-aggressive behavior because my guess is that if you weren't upset at your partner, you probably would have done that task without hesitation. But part of passive-aggressive behavior is that we're holding on to really difficult feelings that we can't express directly. So when we hold on and stuff those feelings, they end up coming out in very indirect, harmful ways, which is what passive-aggressive behavior is. So when we're procrastinating, we're really giving the other person the message that we really don't want to do what they're asking, but we're not willing to say so directly. Another common example of passive-aggressive behavior in codependent relationships is using sarcasm to express ourselves. When you're codependent, you don't want to confront things directly. So making a sarcastic comment is a way to vent your hurt feelings and even play it off as a joke. I know I've done that where sometimes I don't even realize I'm resentful of somebody until I've said something sarcastic and then I realize, uh-oh, something's up because I haven't been willing to own it. And the challenge with sarcasm is that it can appear funny and witty. So we may think it's a good thing, especially if you grew up with that kind of humor growing up where it was kind of biting. But if you're doing this work, you're really going to want to identify those ways you use sarcasm that may actually hurt the other person even when you don't intend to. It's also a way to express your anger or resentment in a way that the other person finds confusing. For instance, that example I gave you when someone asked me for a favor and I say, well, of course, don't I always? If that's my response, I guarantee you I am probably resentful because maybe I've done favors before for them and I really don't want to do it anymore. But I feel like I have no choice. So I say, of course I'm going to help you. But inside, I really don't. And that's where sarcastic comments can become part of our everyday conversation, and I don't want that for you. Another example of passive-aggressive behavior in codependent relationships is giving somebody a backhanded compliment. I remember a family member did this years ago because in my childhood, I tended to gain weight on and off because I used food to cope. And one of my family members would say, wow, it looks like you've lost weight. But it was said with a tone that didn't feel like a compliment. It actually felt more like a criticism. So that backhanded compliment was really confusing. So another example might be, maybe you have a girlfriend that you really resent because they've recently lost weight and you've been really struggling with that. So you say, wow, you've really done well, but the tone isn't necessarily supportive. So what we're doing there is we're trying to be supportive, but our resentment or jealousy gets in the way. So we end up doing a backhanded compliment that can actually be more hurtful. If you've ever received a backhanded compliment, say me too in the comments. You're not alone. I have too, and I know they hurt. So another example of passive-aggressive behavior in codependent relationships is saying yes when you mean no. This is super common. I can't tell you how many times I've done this, where somebody asks me for a favor, and because I've been codependent most of my life, I say yes even when I don't want to do it. They may not know that I'm resentful, but somewhere down the line, it's going to leak out in a sarcastic comment, because when we say yes and we really mean no, which is really a hallmark of a codependent person's behavior, we're really dishonoring our own truth, and I don't want that for you. This is a very common passive-aggressive example that we tend to do in codependent relationships. So again, I don't want you to make yourself bad or wrong for doing it. These are just behaviors we've learned over time, and the purpose of this video is to make you aware of them so that you can make better choices in the future and understand yourself in a better way. Now, another example of passive-aggressive behavior in codependent relationships is gaslighting. And this one is a little tricky because most of us as codependents feel like we've been gaslighted a lot more than we've actually done that to others. But when you think about it, gaslighting is an indirect form of communication where we're trying to deny something that's happened. So in a codependence world, it might look a little bit different, where if somebody is calling me out on my behavior, and I haven't been in recovery for very long, I might deny it. I might say, oh, no, I never did that because I'm too ashamed. So that's where gaslighting can come in, because we're really still denying our own behavior, which makes the other person feel crazy. Another example of passive-aggressive behavior in codependent relationships is avoiding conflict. And this one is huge because when you grow up in a dysfunctional family, you learn that conflict isn't safe. Being able to share your feelings honestly, even when you're hurt or when you're angry, is typically not received well in dysfunctional families. So what you learn to do is you learn to avoid conflict at all costs. You might think, I'm just going to please everybody else and avoid those difficult conversations because I don't know what's going to happen, or I'm going to get hurt by this person if I'm honest. So we learn really early on to stuff our feelings and avoid conflict. The problem is that every relationship eventually has a conflict, and not dealing with that conflict ends up creating a lot of separation, resentment, and tension in the relationship that ends up hurting you in the long run. But you also have to remember that you're not bad or wrong for avoiding conflict. A lot of us do, especially if we're people pleasers. So if this is you, you're not alone. So now I'm going to share that bonus tip with you about how do you stop being passive aggressive. One thing is you have to be willing to deal with your fear. And part of what we have to do when we're dealing with our fears is challenge them as false evidence appearing real. That's the acronym I always refer to from 12-step programs, because often what we fear never actually comes to pass. So what I want you to do is I want you to write down some of your fears about what would happen if you were more direct in your communication and you actually told somebody how you really felt. Do you think they'd be mad at you? Do you think they would leave you? Do you think it would blow up and cause a huge argument? And then I want you to challenge those fears. For instance, has that ever happened in that relationship? Is that person safe enough that that probably wouldn't happen and it's just your fear of the past? Because that's part of what we want to do when changing passive-aggressive behavior, is we want to see what are some simple baby steps that you can do today to be more direct. And I always say, start with the safest people first. Now your next step is to go watch my video on how to communicate in a healthy way, because that's your next step. Thanks so much.